this is Ken Parker welcoming you to Common Ground, the policy roundtable where we bring together panelists with diverse views on issues of concern to Newton residents and try to hammer out some of our differences. For those of you who are new to our show, let's review the format. First, I introduce a topic. Then we go around the table with each panelist expressing a viewpoint. I then select the two panelists who disagree the most strongly and ask them to speak directly to one another in hopes of finding some area of agreement. At the end of each segment, I offer my 2 cents on the topic and give an assessment of how we did at finding common ground. Well, that's the way the show usually works. Much like last month's episode, where we discussed the override, this month's episode will focus on a single topic, which is the proposed village zoning in Newton, with the hopes that we can learn from some very, very knowledgeable panelists about what's in the proposal and maybe get some of their insights onto what's coming down the pike, so to speak, with future changes to the proposals and other expanded zoning proposals that are also in the works. Hopefully we can also coax them into giving their views on it. But it won't be quite like our usual format where we have a vigorous disagreement, I'm guessing, more trying to understand what's happening. That having been said, our distinguished panelists are not shy about their views, and so without further ado, let me introduce them. We have Pam Wright. Hi, Pam.
Hi.
Great to see you.
Thank you.
Pam is a city councilor at large from Ward 3.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And Pam, can you remind me your day job is you're an engineer, is it?
Well, my background is in electrical engineering, but now I manage some of our properties and I do a lot of volunteer work.
Great. And you also, as a city councilor, serve on a couple of the committees of the council. What are your current committee assignments?
ZAP, zoning and planning, where a lot of this is coming
So you're
forth.
in the weeds on this.
Oh, yes,
on this,
I'm very much in the weeds. And then program and services, too.
the most important committee on the city council, as those of us who served on it well know. Anyway, thank you so much for coming on, Pam, to talk about this really important and sometimes difficult for people to grasp issue of zoning reform and village center zoning. Also joined by Mark Loreto, my brother at the bar. So to speak. Mark, I know you were, first of all, president of the city council for a while, and you were chair of the land use committee. You're a councilor at large from Ward 7, which is the eastern part of Newton, I think it's fair to say.
That's right.
What is your current set of committee assignments?
So currently I serve on the Land Use Committee and the Public Facilities Committee. I've served in those committees my entire tenure on the City Council, and I'm chair.
So you missed out on programs and
I've
services.
missed out on programs and services. You know, the Ward 7 councils have always been very collegial, and as you know, we divide up the committees. And
of course, Lyle Baker has programs and services, and he ain't giving it up.
He's very happy there. He does a wonderful job, and I wouldn't trade it with him at all. I also chair the Real Property Reuse Committee as well. And my day job, as you said, I'm a partner at the law firm of Loreto and Smith. I'm one of the founders of the firm and been there for a while. Long while, I guess.
And I've seen you in a courtroom on at least one occasion, and it's great to have your keen legal acumen on the city council, along with a few other members of the bar who provide that. I mean, as legislators, it's good to know what goes into.
It's very helpful, but I'll add that it's very helpful to have an array of skill sets. Pam, for example, with an engineering background, really brings a perspective that often is missing from our city council work, but certainly the legal background is helpful in crafting council orders and understanding process and statutes and so forth.
So it is terrific to have you both here to help our audience understand some of the process and some of the proposed statutes or ordinances, as we call them locally. Before we get at all into the weeds, though, I just want to back up and do the 10,000-foot perspective, because last time I was learning about what the council was considering, I know that there was a big citywide, they were calling it zoning reform initiative. And this village piece is not the whole thing, right? So, I mean, it would be, if you could please just sort of, where is that bigger piece, and how did this come to the forefront, and what's going on? What are the other pieces of the puzzle?
So at the beginning, they were focusing on the neighborhoods, out into the neighborhoods, but there was a lot of pushback. And so we went with the village centers. That there seems to be overall, people want to make some changes there. Then while we're starting to do this, the governor signed the MBTA Act, which requires Newton to zone for 8,330 units by right. And so we're doing two things. We're doing rezoning the village center. We're gonna see how much of that will qualify for the 8,330 units for rezoning. And then,
So this is an additional 8,330 units that need to be created to comply
well,
with,
not created, it just needs to be zoned for.
permitted for.
And it's zoned by right. But as I've put out a memo, is we're doing a lot of multifamilies already. And since 2020, we have approved or in the pipeline or about to get in the pipeline over 3,500 units.
So let me just, so I understand the math on what this law requires. If you currently have a lot in the city that's zoned single family, one unit is allowed by right there. If you rezone that to be a two-family multifamily, would that give you credit for one of those 8,300 and some odd
No,
units?
they need to be multifamily first, which is
Well, isn't
three or
Oh,
more.
3 or more.
More.
Under
And-
our zoning, a multifamily district can be 2 or more.
So it's 3 or more, and then we have to have a density of a minimum of 15 units per gross acre. Now, what people think is, oh, it's 15 units per acre that's buildable. It's actually higher because you got to include in the area your roads, your sidewalk, things that are unbuildable, parks. We've had some people.
So 15 units per acre, so that means a unit per, let's just to do the math here, that would mean per like 6,000 square feet or so, no, actually, well, what was 40 to
think.
40 divided by 15? Sorry, no, that would that would be
That's
like
really-
less than 3, that'd be 2,667.
Something like that.
Right.
But in reality.
Which is much less than, of course, we require now.
Yeah, and in reality, though, if you look at the different villages, it's going to be a higher number. So in West Newton, there's quite a bit that's unbuildable, and I believe it's about 40%. So that number actually goes to 25 units per buildable acre.
Oh, so then you're down to.
minimum, yeah.
So you're down to less than 2,000 square feet per unit. That's a pretty small amount of land area to put one unit on in Newton, inconsistent with our history anyway.
Well, and then with multifamilies, you're talking about multiple floors in
Sure.
heights.
So we can get into some of the numbers on what that means in terms of what would be allowed. But so there was this citywide proposal that was being very enthusiastically pushed, I think, by the administration, particularly the planning department for a while, and by certain members of the council, I believe. And we talked about that around this table in great detail, where there were cluster zoning proposals, and there were pretty significant increases in density that would be allowed throughout the city. Plus, they were redefining zoning districts and changing zoning lines. So my question, is all that off the table,
No,
or is that?
absolutely not. So I think you got to be very clear about this. We are embarking through our planning department under the mayor's direction, an overall effort what's been termed zoning reform, and that use of that term is deliberate. The idea is that we need to reform our zoning code that is not working well. So there's that. Starting with that premise, was an effort first to start with the neighborhoods, and as Pam said, that met with a lot of pushback, and then around a little over a year ago now, the mayor and the planning department and the chair of the zoning and planning committee announced that they were going to take a pause to that and instead focus on the village centers first. I happen to think that was a smart decision, because really the village centers are the ones that I think we want to be very concerned about for economic vitality. And it makes sense to have some more density in those village centers.
So just to be clear, since we are talking about village centers today, I want to put up on the screen the images of the borders of what we're actually talking about. So I'm going to see if Will, our director, can put those up on the screen. This would be the starting with the page 3 of the PowerPoints that we had. Let's see, and that would be Newton Center. Let's see if we can put Newton Center up. Okay, it's behind me. I wonder if we can put it on the whole screen for our viewers at home to get a better look at it. If not, I will just play Vanna White. Oh no, there it is. I think this should be visible to people. The idea being that we're talking about in Newton Center going as far over past Trowbridge all the way to looks like that's over to Norwood down Center Street, basically parallel to the T-tracks, and then over to almost all the way over to Tyler Terrace, the other end on Center Street, and then to the east along Beacon all the way Dalton. That's Dalton Street. It's hard to read in the small font size here, but over to Dalton. So it's really, I think, fairly consistent with what is now a commercially zoned area, mostly with a little bit overflowing into what are now residential properties. Would that be, Pam? Is that your understanding that they're mostly commercially
Yes,
used
in
now?
this one, and maybe if we can see the map again, we can take a look. So it's broken up into 3 areas. VC1, which is more the residential that's close to your village center. VC2, which is could be all residential or mixed use, and that allows a maximum building height of 4 stories with the top floor setback 7 feet. And then your really core of your village center is VC3, and that allows up to 5 stories with the top story set back. Now, this is the first version of the maps, and there's going to be a second version coming out, and they did get a lot of feedback.
Well, just to slow down for 1 second, so our audience can see the map on the screen. VC1 is the green area,
Yep.
and that is what I would characterize, and correct me if I'm wrong, as the least dense under this proposal.
Correct.
VC2 is the moderately dense, and then VC3 is the most dense. So
Yes.
VC2 is red, and you can see
Yeah.
that's a pretty big. I mean, it's got a red border. No, it's actually blue. Sorry.
No, it's red. VC3 is in the red border.
VC3 is red. VC2 are these various blue
Blue.
things next to the green, and VC3 is the red in the middle.
Yeah, and so VC3, what they're proposing on there is,
Looks like they're proposing to build on the triangle right now.
well, it is allowed to be built upon the triangle.
That's
But,
city property, so they would have to partner
well, it's
with
kind of like on Austin Street, that was
Right.
city property too.
Sure.
So,
reuse committee. Right?
so what this is doing is under 30,000 square foot lot, you would build by right. And you're
So
allowed.
just for our audience's benefit, by right means you don't have to go to the city council for a special permit.
Correct.
As a developer, you can just say,
Go to ISD.
yeah, you go to City Hall, to the Inspectional Service Department, say, here are our plans. They stamp the plans as complying with the relevant ordinances and building codes, and you're good to go.
Yep. And so these would allow up to a 15,000 square foot footprint at 5 stories, and that would translate into about a 72,000
So the
square
15,000
foot.
square foot applies in the VC3 then.
Yes.
So, is that right?
It
Yes.
is, but let me we're
Okay,
we're
going the-
throwing out lots and lots and lots of numbers.
Yeah, no, you've got a good point, Mark.
And I think Pam and I are, as we like to say, literally in the weeds all the time. And Pam, I have to give her a compliment, is particularly talented at actually looking at this stuff, because the details are critical and they do matter. I think the takeaway is, conceptually, VC1 is lower density and lower heights than VC2, lower than VC3. And I think, I can't speak for everyone in the council, but I think at least theoretically, many, if not most of us, agree with that kind of concept, that you want greater, if you're gonna have more density, you want that to be in the heart of your village centers. It makes sense.
Well, let me just ask you, because there's something that runs directly opposite to something that I learned on the city council and in my time in public life in Newton, which is that most of your ratables under for tax purposes are your commercial properties, and a very significant percentage of our commercial properties are located in our village centers. And commercial properties, of course, provide services. They're restaurants, they're stores, but they're also taxed at basically twice the rate as residential. They don't put kids in the schools. So they're the engine that funds much of our local government. And what I see this proposal as proposing, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is allowing on properties that are currently zoned for commercial use only to allow people to build, developers to build residential only properties.
Let me offer you.
Is that wrong?
Let me offer a slight correction there. First of all, the VC1 zone is almost all residential anyways now. So you're not substituting commercial for residential. VC2 has some commercial in it, but often not a lot. It's the VC3 and parts of VC2 that already have existing commercial, but a lot of that commercial is one story, or at least not insignificant amount of it's one story. The argument here is that you would require commercial use on the first floor and allow either residential or office use on other floors. Now, if you look at that map, this is where we get into a huge tension between the new MBTA Communities Act and our zoning. Because according to the MBTA Communities Act, if we want to make a new zone that complies with MBTA Communities Act, we cannot mandate mixed use on the first floor.
Okay, but just to back up for a second, Mark. I mean, I'm not reading ordinance language. I'm looking at some of these maps. But it certainly seems to me that VC2 and VC3 at least are all commercial. And I think I see some properties in these VC1s that are currently commercial as well. And so what I'm wondering is whether just simply could as a developer, could someone just walk in and say, I'm buying the building, I don't know, that Walgreens is in now on Langley Road, it's in VC1, and I'd like to build apartments there instead. Could they do that without going to the city council for a special permit and without going for a zoning change? Could they just do that by right?
They would
under
have
this
to have
proposal?
mixed use on the first floor.
On that example, and the
Okay.
Walgreens lot is over 30,000 square feet, and it would go to special
Well,
permit.
they could subdivide
But
that.
They
they
could
could
subdivide,
divide,
yeah.
I mean, I would expect any savvy developer to take that lot, divide it, put a small building on the rear of the lot, and then build on an under 30,000 square foot lot so they could build by right
Okay.
with whatever they want.
So let's take one of these VC2s then. I mean, they're scattered around Newton
Yep.
Center.
Sure.
They're currently commercial.
Yep.
Some of these are clearly under 30,000 square feet. I think some of these are under, some of these look like they're 10,000 square
Yep.
feet. Could someone come in and say, I'm gonna take this commercial building, it's a bank now,
Yep.
It's a restaurant now, whatever it is, and just put housing there?
Yes, if it's, in this proposal, there's the solid black lines, there they want to mandate, and they're trying to figure it out how to do it. Commercial, but anywhere
first
else,
floor
on the
only,
first floor. And,
yeah.
but anywhere else, if there's commercial there and it's already in VC2,
Okay.
they could make it all residential.
So this seems like a good way of destroying our tax base in the city.
Well,
But-
you know, I think that's I'm not sure that's a completely a fair statement, Ken. I think, I would argue that we have to do a better job of actually having more commercial space in the city. And we have,
But Mark, just to determine whether it's fair or not, I want to whether it's accurate is what I'm trying to go for. And is it accurate that you could turn existing commercially zoned properties into residential?
yes.
Yes.
And so, as long as you have it on, at least
So,
in VC.
putting aside my judgment as to whether that's wise public policy, just so our audience can understand, turning many properties which are currently zoned business-only use would be residential would be allowable by right.
Although
That's a very
I
significant
will
change.
say, again, though, you're right that with the special permit process, though, we have been routinely allowing housing or mixed use to go in business-only zones. And we've been doing that for years now in the city council.
So what this would allow developers to do is skip the city council.
Yep.
Developers could then go and.
That's one of the big issues there, and personally, that's one of the.
Well, Mark, isn't there, at least back in my day, we always believed that we could extract some public benefit through the special permit process?
That is, I like to think that the special permit process actually is a very good one. It does take time, it does take some more money, but at the end of the day, it allows, in my view, for much, much better projects because they're more thoroughly vetted. The developers have to address the legitimate concerns of the abutters. They have to try to provide benefits to the city. And if you allow a development by right, you don't get any of that.
So let's go to another difference, and I think you're absolutely right, Mark. We shouldn't get too much into the weeds. So just real high level, looking at this Village Center proposal, I see that VC1 is listed as requiring 30% open space, and then VC2 and 3 are 5%.
But that is only for lots over 30,000 square
Ah.
feet. So if it's smaller than that, there's no requirement of open space.
There's none at all?
There's none, but you have your setbacks. You have your side setbacks or rear setback, unless it's,
So again, I'm very confused here because as Mark pointed out a minute ago, VC1, a lot of that is existing residential.
yep.
And existing residential requires 50% open space. So would this proposal take that 50% and move it down to 0%?
Not zero, because you got your setbacks, and you have
What
a
would it be then?
It depends. Now, I did take a look at VC3, and it depends on the lot size, because you can have multiple buildings on the lot, but again, you have to have space between them. In VC1, you can have multiple buildings on a lot. You have a footprint of 4,000 square feet, and I believe it's 15 feet between buildings. There's some parking requirement, but we haven't figured that out. and
Okay,
some
so
people
I
wanna-
see setbacks of 10 feet or 20 feet. So that's still, maybe you're at 5% open space, but you're not at a lot with a 5 or 10 foot setback.
Look, there is no doubt that under this proposal, you're gonna see a much greater level of density on any of the lots that are affected here.
But you're gonna see fewer trees, fewer
Well,
yards.
that's what, when you have
Well,
density.
no, but there's vertical density
There's
too,
vertical
with
and
an open
there's
space
gonna be
requirement.
both greater vertical density and greater horizontal density, at least under the current proposals that we have.
So at least some of the previous generation of zoning reform proposals maintained open space requirements. And now I don't know if that was in in other words, there were still like 30 or 40% required open space, like
Yeah.
in their cluster development. It was
Yeah.
going to be in the middle of the cluster.
Yes.
There was shared open space. What I'm seeing here is much less open space, even in the VC1, the one that is titled residential, than exists on those lots at present. Again, I may be misunderstanding this, but
You're correct, and and the planning department recognizes there are a lot of issues in the VC1. What their idea is taking these old houses, and generally near the village centers, you have old, Victorians and things like that, and they'd like to, with a modest addition, be able to put 3, 4, 5 units in there, which is not allowed today. But the way it is zoned for is it's gonna push to tear it down and put up 2 buildings. So one of the houses they looked at was in Newtonville, 424 Newtonville, and presently it's
424 Newtonville Ave?
Newtonville Ave, yes, and it's a beautiful old Victorian, 3-family, 6,800 square feet, and it would be nice, maybe do 4 or 5 or 6 units in there. Well, the proposed zoning would allow 2 buildings for a total of over 19,000 square feet between the 2 buildings. So, and generally our houses are in the middle of the lot, so it's kind of in the way. So if a developer wants to, have 3 times more space in 2 different buildings, and the house is in the way, that'll go down and they'll put 2 separate buildings there.
Yeah, so much of what we're doing here, I think, requires us to think much more carefully than we have been about what developers are going to do or likely to do, and not what we want them to do.
That's a great point, Mark.
And, you know, developers, and I say this repeatedly, we need developers. Developers are very good in that we need people who are going to buy and build and improve upon land. That is good. But developers are motivated generally by one goal and one goal only, and that is to make money, and that's fine. We're a capitalist system, and I believe in capitalism. It works. But that's where it's so important that city government provides some check and balance as to what a developer can do. Because the developer's interests may coincide with what the city's interests are and may not. And with the special permit process, you make sure that what the developer does is more likely to be in the interest of the city and not just the interest of the particular developer. Now, you can craft zoning rules to encourage developers to make financial decisions to do certain things, but as Pam said, if you write an ordinance or a zoning code that would make it more financially feasible, or economically beneficial to knock down an existing structure and build more, the typical developer, if they can do it by right, is going to do that. And there's, again,
Mark,
that
I
makes
want to
sense.
talk specifics because I think it's much easier
Yeah.
for our audience to
Sure.
get their mind around it. So I'm gonna mention a lot. I'm not gonna say who owns it or what the address is because I don't want anybody looking it up. But there's a lot about 5,000 square feet near a village center that's in one of these districts. It's a single family house now, and the house has a building footprint that is probably less than 4,000 square feet. But if I understand this proposal correctly, you could knock that down. It's in one of these VC1 areas, and you could put in a 2.5-story building, and there is no limit to the number of units. So you could make my first apartment. My wife and I, before we were married in college, we had a little apartment in Sunderland, Massachusetts. It was 400 square feet. So just for the sake of argument, if the developer found it to be profitable, Mark, because that's what they're looking for, they could say, you know what, 4,000 square foot building footprint, we can put 10 units per floor, we can do 2.5 floors of them, so 25 units we're going to fit on a lot that right now has 1 unit. Am I getting this wrong somehow? Or would that be allowable without going to the city council under this proposal, from 1 to 25 units?
It's sort of right. So the building that's correct about the building. Right now, we're discussing the parking, and generally parking is the gating factor of how big the building is or how many units you can have. And we're still in discussion. There are some councilors that don't want to require any parking requirements. What they're proposing right now is a half of parking per unit. So, you know, putting, how many units did you say? Like
25.
25, you know, right now that would require 12 units of parking, what's being proposed, or 13.
Well,
units,
right now,
or
it would require
13.
50 parking spaces, it would require 2
Yeah,
per-
but in the
2 per unit.
proposal, it would be about 13. But some want to go to
So
zero.
they could do an underground garage for
They
that.
could, which is expensive, and it depends how big it
It's
is.
happening
actually.
across the street from me. I mean, it might be expensive, but it's
Yep.
happening in Newton now.
Yep.
And that's only for 7 units.
And the economics of an underground garage get, even though they're expensive, you know, garage or underground garage parking is an attractive feature for many people. They like that when they're looking to buy a house because their car stays nice and warm and dry in the winter. And a lot of folks like that.
So again, I'm just trying to get my head around these, because usually zoning changes over the years. I mean, again, I was on the city council, then board of aldermen for 18 years. And usually zoning amendments, well, we're going to take this setback requirement and move it by 10%. And they were like, or we're going to, you know, the floor area ratio requirement is going to go from 0.35 to 0.4. This seems like a very radical departure from what we're used to. Am I wrong about that, Mark?
No, and it's interesting. When, you know, the rationale for some of this work has been changing over time. the initial rationale was the zoning code doesn't work well, it's too cumbersome, it's too hard, we need to simplify it and fix it. And then, and not change what the built look of the city is. I think over time, there's been far less concern with that factor, and in fact, there are folks who believe that we really should be radically changing our zoning code because we should be building a lot more housing in the city, period. That is driving much of our work. And you also have folks, and the council frankly is pretty divided on this, and I suspect the public may be too. What parking requirements do you need? I think most of us agree that our parking requirements are probably, we probably require too much parking in most instances, but what's the right amount? Should we have no parking requirements at all? What will that do to people wanting to park in the street year round? What will that do to, our congestion in our streets? Those are very legitimate concerns.
Well, it certainly, as Pam points out, is a limit, and as a practical matter, to the number of units you can build, right?
It's a limiting factor
Yep.
on how many you can build.
Unless you're going to build underground, I suppose.
Unless
right?
you're going to build underground, that is correct. So having some parking requirements does limit your ability to build. Now, whether a developer is going to build your 400 square foot
I'm just
unit-
talking about what would be allowed, not
No.
whether it would make economic sense and whether they would do
no,
it.
but my point is, there's also the argument that smaller units are, by definition, more affordable. You pay less per square foot, and that will help with the diversity of income.
Again, I'm not talking about the merits of whether it's good that they could build 25 units. I'm just trying to understand whether they could do that by right.
The point I was going to make is ironic, though, that we're talking about that at a time post-pandemic when many more people have been working from home. At least those of us who are in jobs were able to do that. But for Newton, that's a very significant number of people. And those people are actually saying, I need more space in my home, not less. I need a bigger place, not a smaller place. So you have those tensions as well. And frankly, the average family in America wants much more space and takes much more space for granted in their house than their parents or their grandparents did. And I certainly know that's certainly true for me.
Mark, I think there's a lot of wisdom to what you say that people want more space. However, there's also, I think, a cold economic calculation says, well, if I were to build an 800 square foot unit, what could I sell that for? If I were to build two 400 square foot units, what could I sell those for? And even if, in other words, developers might not be serving the interests of those people who want more space, they might be serving the interests of themselves by building things that are,
And
they
don't
can
get me wrong,
cram more in.
I'm not saying that we don't have a need for additional smaller units in the city. I think we do. But again, the real questions come down to what dimensional controls are you going to put in place? And then are you going to have a process whereby the city has some approval or not? And where is that line going to be drawn?
So
and this proposal is a radical change in that regard.
that's what I'm getting at.
There's
This is
no two
not.
ways about it.
This is not even. This isn't tweaking. This isn't even
No.
doubling or tripling what can be done. It is an order of magnitude greater density that it's talking about.
It is a
allowing.
much
Yes.
greater density, but I think equally and perhaps for me more importantly is the lack of any safeguard on the special permit process, because it means the developer doesn't have to talk to the neighbors. The developer can just come in and do what the developer wants to do as long as they follow the rules. Now,
It doesn't sound like there's much left in the way of rules. They're pretty. It's like Wild West.
I
zoning
just want
almost.
to. I'll add one thing. This MBTA communities law is going to be very difficult to properly implement. I think the law is well intentioned, very well intentioned. The problem, of course, is when you get beyond well intentioned laws, you actually have to implement. And I think it's pretty clear now. The state is saying, despite the way the statute's written and some of the guidelines, you must implement or you're going to lose significant funding. and including perhaps the train stations in West Newton, Auburndale, and Newtonville. So we are going to implement this law. But now the question is how we do it. It doesn't mean we're going to build 8,000 more units. That's not a given at all. But in creating the by right ability to build all residential in a number of areas in the city, you are going to encourage significant tear down, because it will be a developer's economic interest to knock down whatever's there and put up a 4, 5, 6 unit building underneath your inclusionary zoning number in the name of more density. And I think developers will do that.
So
And that's in part the intent of the law.
Mark, it's funny that you mentioned the tear down possibility. Between high school and college,
Yeah.
I spent a year working on Capitol Hill for then Congressman Barney Frank as a congressional intern. And one of the projects I got to work on was looking at how mayors and cities were using community development block grant and urban development action grant funds. And it turns out they were knocking down what I would call naturally affordable housing, and what Congressman Frank was thinking, these are areas where people actually live, and they were essentially gentrifying them with new development that was much more expensive. So in using, in other words, federal dollars to make things less affordable. In some cases, they were putting up luxury hotels and building parking lots and whatnot, but in some cases, just new housing where old housing was more affordable. And it goes to your point about intentions. We may intend to make Newton more affordable with this, and we may have the exact opposite effect. I mean, I can't tell you, like, I mentioned I live on Walnut Street in Newton Highlands. There is a by right development across the street from me where we had a older 2-family house there that got replaced by 2, I think we would call them snout houses, where the garages pop out, and they sold for $1.7 million each. I challenge anyone within the sound of my voice to tell me that someone in need of affordable housing who's worried about having a roof over their head can afford $1.7 million. Now, that having been said, if this zoning change were actually to result in 400 square foot units, yeah, that would be a good thing in the sense that there would be, that would be more affordable. I'm not criticizing 400 square foot units, but what I'm saying is, I don't know, I think this is going to be, there's going to be a lot of unintended consequences because so much is allowed here.
Well, that's the law of unintended consequences is a very good one to cite. And I think, I know Pam in particular, and I've tried as well, to constantly challenge the assumptions that are being made by our planning department and challenge them to make sure that we are examining them carefully. And another one is, and this is one of my pet peeves, I think Pam shares as well, when we get pictures of what things are going to look like, we're not getting a fully built out pictures. And that creates, in my mind, potentially very misleading narrative for the public. What I would much prefer is show the public the fully built out, kind of what it could be if you build out. Then show them something in between, and then show them what you have now. Because you're not going to get everything built out to the maximum.
Under what's allowed on these proposals.
Right.
So the reason why I wanted to take that example of the 5,000-ish square foot lot where you're putting, you could go from 1 unit to 25 units, is to illustrate this Wild West effect here, which is we're basically taking zoning control away. And I mean, Mark, you make the point repeatedly about special permit process providing a control, but to me, even if you allowed it 25 units by special permit, why, my question to you and to Pam is, why would, if we have something that we want, why wouldn't we say what we want and allow that? For example, if it were our goal to have smaller units, why wouldn't we say, you get a density bonus of more units if you have a maximum unit size of X square feet. Maybe it's 400, maybe it's 800, whatever the goal is. This doesn't seem to put any constraints on what developers can do regarding it, and it doesn't present a vision of what we want. Isn't zoning supposed to provide some guidelines and objectives as to what we're trying to achieve? I mean,
So what this is just providing is some guidelines for the box, you know, and the developers can decide what's inside the box. Right now, we have, depending what your lot is zoned, how many units you can have per, you know, square feet, which I think in our village center is like for every 1,000 square foot of a lot, you can have 1 unit, which is pretty large. But here, we're taking that away completely, so we could have the 400 square foot units in there. So we're doing some things with setbacks and height and
when you say we are, is this something you're proposing?
No,
or-
no, 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 this is not what, this is what's in ZAP that we're discussing, that's coming out
So
of
when you
the
say we're
planning
doing, this
department.
nothing that's passed yet, this is in the
No.
proposal?
Now, they wanna vote on this by,
Who's they? I'm
they,
sorry.
the city,
The leadership of the zoning and
Oh,
planning
yeah.
committee and the leadership of the city council would like to bring this to a vote by the end of this term. And there's
and we wanna vote it out of ZAP by June, what they're looking at, and then a few months later to vote it by, you know.
So
the
when you
whole
say
city
we,
council.
you mean?
I
The whole
think
city,
June
yeah.
is gonna be
Oh, I think that's it,
extraordinarily
yes.
difficult.
So just to be clear, the end of this term, this is an odd numbered year. I'm just thinking it's
Yeah.
23
It's an
now.
election year, Ken.
Yes, yes,
We're
okay.
up for reelection.
So the end of this
I'm
term-
running, okay?
Okay.
And I think
So
Pam
I
is
have
too.
The end of this
Let's put that
term.
right out
Oh, we
there.
got news. We made news tonight.
I
Mark
announced-
Laredo and
I
Pam Wright
announced-
announced on Common Ground they're running for
I
re-election.
announced 3 months ago, so
All
I'm
right.
ahead
Oh,
of the
well.
game.
Oh, you really? Oh, okay. Oh, well. So this is the first time you've mentioned it on television, though, right?
It is.
Okay, there you go. But the question, so you're saying that by the end of the term, just so I understand this, do you mean before the election or during the lame duck by the end of the year?
If you have to ask what my expectation is, it would be in the lame duck session, just because I don't necessarily think people want to go on, some people
On record before
may
the
not want to
election.
go on record if they have a contested election and this is an issue in their race.
Well,
And-
gosh, I think it should be voted on before the election so that people can.
I'm
have-
comfortable voting on it before
Yeah.
election because I think people have the right to know where I stand on this type of issue.
And then
It's a
on
big issue.
Yeah, and on top of that is we need to pass our MBTA zoning by the end of this year,
By the end of the calendar year?
the calendar year. And
Well,
so,
dumb question. Why don't do that first? Because that's mandated by the state
Well,
law.
I think you're talking to two people who share your view. I don't know, since we have to do the MBTA zoning work, that's a given. It, to me, makes much more sense to get that done. Now, you can still do some of your planning for the village centers at the same time, because you want to make sure that they're aligned with one another. You wouldn't want to have an MBTA community zone and then have it completely at odds with your village center, but to pass your village center zoning first, I think is the wrong way
See,
to
to me,
go.
the MBTA community zone is about residential development.
Yes.
It's all about
all-
residential
And
development.
so why would you not want to put that where there's existing residential instead of turning existing commercial into residential?
So one of the things, part of it, it needs to be within a half mile of a train or a T.
Sure.
And so it needs to be generally closer to our village centers. It has to have that
But it doesn't
density.
have to be in the
No,
very
no.
center.
No, but I
No.
don't think we'd want to be creating in a current single-family only zone, which is all residential, which is a quarter mile or a third of a mile from the T. I don't think we'd want to plunk down and say now a developer can come in, buy up a bunch of houses and build and build and build. I think
know,
there's
five-story
tremendous
buildings
Well,
and
I mean,
things
the-
like
the-
that.
so the question is, I mean, this is a funny idea, but if you have to do 8,000 units by right, why don't you say they can't be, sure, they can't be more than 400 square feet, and you could get to, you
It's
know.
not,
Well,
no,
'cause-
it's, because when you count a unit size under the MBTA Communities Act, I think they're using an
1,000.
average of 1,000 square feet a unit. Remember, it's a mathematical calculation. Ability to build 15 1,000 square foot units per acre, with acre including public land and streets and sidewalks and
See,
everything else.
you don't get credit if there's more than 15 allowed by right?
No, And it doesn't matter what's on the lot.
It's the ability.
It's just the zoning.
But is it ability to build above and beyond what's there now? Because it's not
No,
an
it-
increase.
it doesn't matter.
look at
Doesn't
what's
matter,
there now?
because it's what you can build by right. It needs to have that density of,
Mm-hmm.
15 units per gross acre. Now, UTL has been looking at the numbers and what's
I'm
being.
sorry, who's been looking at the numbers?
UTL, the consultant, has been
Okay,
looking
our
at.
audience doesn't know UTL.
UTL
This is a consultant that the planning department has been using for a lot of this zoning, and they have done some zoning in other cities and towns. And so they've been calculating how many units will qualify towards the MBTA numbers of 8,330, and we're not gonna make it. So then they're gonna go down the corridors, what the planning department has says, that we will increase by right zoning along the corridors being Washington Street, Needham Street, and Route 9.
Because there's MBTA buses there, is that the idea?
Well, the
Route 9
buses-
won't- Route 9 won't count though.
Well, Elliott, by the
Elliott
Elliott,
will, but
and
that's
then
it.
by Chestnut.
Okay,
Chestnut
so,
Block.
okay, so they've got a game plan that they consider village center zoning to be phase one essentially of their MBTA.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
And, okay, so I understand the rationale. I don't think I agree with it, but at least I understand the rationale to why they're proceeding that way. Sounds like the greater challenge is complying with the MBTA Communities Act, and one
Oh, yes.
should put that up front and figure out a plan
I
for
will,
dealing
I'll
with
just
it.
add, I think if we had, if we as if our, taken a somewhat more moderate approach to this whole process, I think we would be and would get much further along than we are now. And unfortunately, I think our zoning process has become very polarized and is polarizing the city. And that's because there's this desire to just drive through certain particular viewpoints. And I find that very unfortunate. I think we would be far better off if we step back and tried to compromise here. And I think we'd get there. You know, and a good example is the special permit process. Instead of really saying, we don't like the special permit process, we basically want to abolish it, except for a handful of very large developments. Understand that it plays a valuable role, but you might tweak it some. You might say for certain projects under 5,000 or 10,000 square feet, you don't need it. Parking requirements are the same thing in village centers. For smaller projects, sure, maybe you just say we're not going to have any parking requirements. But instead, we're trying to make, in the name of progress, trying to make wholesale changes. And again, a lot of unintended consequences ahead of us if we do that.
Well, I mean, I for one am concerned that one of the unintended consequences is going to be air pollution and really environmental degradation of the increased traffic and density. The kind of density that would be allowed by some of this would shut down the functionality of our village centers and at a certain point make Newton cease to be Newton. It would be an urban center. It wouldn't be a suburb anymore.
We'll be more like 13 cities instead of 13 villages.
I think in fairness, I think, Ken, some folks really do feel that this is, we're an urban area and we should be an urban city.
Oh, no.
And I'm not,
right.
and that's part of the viewpoint
Well,
that's driving some of
let's
this
put it this
discussion.
way. There are many of us who chose to buy a house in Newton who chose not to buy a house in Boston. I have friends who chose to buy a house or an apartment, a condo in Boston, because they like being in that kind of dense urban environment. So the question is, are Newton residents aware that there's a proposed fairly radical transformation of our community on the table?
I'd say a couple of years ago when there was an effort to really rezone the entire city, I think folks became aware of that and were rather unhappy. And that's why the mayor's office put a pause on this, and which was, as I said, the right thing to do. I don't think enough people in the city are aware of this. I don't think people.
I mean, honestly, I wasn't aware of the details of this until we started planning the show.
I don't think, you know, when the planning department has gone out to specific villages and met with counselors from the ward and residents, and they're starting to see some of the plans, you're starting to get more feedback. But that's just starting, it's been going on slowly, but I would venture to guess that the vast majority of folks in the city have very little understanding of what's going on and very little understanding of the MBTA Communities Act. Again, it's one of those laws that sounds great. We are going to build more housing. It's good.
Well,
But the question is,
let
of course,
me-
how you're gonna do it.
Well, let me, I noticed that one of the reports that that came out is actually from someone who was favorably inclined to this zoning. It was the Newton Housing Partnership co-chairs that they wrote a letter saying that the Village Center zoning proposal, while something they support, people should be aware it's not an affordable housing proposal, and it will not create more affordable housing. I think that there's a lot of people out there who think all housing is necessarily good. Again, I'm not convinced that more housing for people who can afford a $1.7 million unit is something we need in Newton. I'd be much more excited by a proposal that had a maximum unit size, because I think that would be naturally affordable. I don't know what that size would be, but that would, and to put a certain amount of that in our village centers, maybe allowing upper story on top of existing residential, could be a good compromise. But that doesn't, this seems to give carte blanche to developers to do all residential, a mixed use. It doesn't say keep commercial on the first floor and we'll let you build higher with a limited unit size, which I think could be a great compromise.
I think there's so much work here, Ken, and you know, on one hand, we have the big picture philosophical debates and discussions, which we're having now, and there's always going to be some division and disagreement about that. Although I think a not insignificant number of us, I think most of us are comfortable with making changes to the code. Always room for improvement, in my view, and you know, some additional.
The question is whether a given change is an improvement or
always
is detrimental.
Always the question. I think what all we can as counselors can do is both try to educate members of the public, and being on this show is a good way of doing it, and asking people to start paying attention and giving us their opinions, pro and con. You know, we need to, because unfortunately on this issue in particular, we tend to hear from the same voices all the time, and they tend to be on either extreme, and that by definition is not healthy and probably not representative of what most folks in the city actually think.
Well, Mark, you're absolutely right that this has been polarizing for the city. I mean, to the point where, frankly, I mean, from what I hear from folks who are involved in city government, and you guys both have a front row seat on this, the city council is less of a cordial and collegial place, and I mean collegial, I guess would be the right word, than it used to be, because people define one another by their disagreements over zoning and have trouble finding common ground on other issues. Is that a fair characterization?
I do think it's a fair characterization. It's probably been exacerbated, and we had a conversation about this the other night. It's been exacerbated by the fact that we're not in person as much. And you know, I'm the first to enjoy the comfort of my home when I'm on yet another long committee meeting, third one of the week. But on the
and
other
you can play
hand,
Minesweeper at the same time, right?
I'm not admitting to anything. Although I can go and get dessert occasionally, or talk to my daughter if she has a question, and can interrupt. But the negative is that we don't have the opportunity to talk in person like the three of us are doing now. And I think that's the way you build collegiality. But this has been, I think, unfortunately polarizing, and I think in part that's because there's some insistency of doing it my way is the only way.
Well,
And I think that's unfortunate.
It really is. Well, Pam, have you noticed that kind of lack of collegiality?
Well, I started on the council and I was there only about 2 months before we shut down, so.
Oh, okay. I guess you don't have as much of the history. I mean, I can say that, you know, again, I was first elected in 1991, served, you know, from 92 through 2009. And over the course of that period, I often thought to myself, well, I better be nice to my colleagues, because my worst enemy on one issue is going to be my best friend on the next one. And so we really did have and I actually got people I disagreed very strongly with on things I got along with very well.
Occasionally we've had that on this council, and we had I can't remember the issues, but we had a couple of debates not too long ago, maybe about artificial turf, I think. And we did not align along, frankly, the traditional lines that this council for the last 3.5 years has been aligning. I thought it was great. I loved the fact that people I might ordinarily disagree with agree with me, and people I usually agreed with disagree with me because
That's
we're,
refreshing, isn't
we
it?
are,
Yes.
I mean, you know, we can joke about it, but in all seriousness, we're a far better governing body for the city if we do that.
I
And
think
that's
that-
one of the benefits of a 24-person council, if it's done right as well, that we get
A diversity of viewpoint.
a
That's what.
diversity of
That's
viewpoints.
always been the selling point that people have said. You know, we only have a couple minutes left in the show. I know our audience is like, we want more zoning discussion, because everybody loves zoning discussion. And as these things evolve, I hope you'll both come back and talk about it
course.
more. And you know, and I will try to get more diversity of viewpoint around this table to hear some of the advocates for these changes. But tonight, I just wanted to catch up on like what's going on more. But because we only have a couple minutes left in the show and there is an election on Tuesday, I just want to put in my 2 cents that I know people are very focused not on Newton things, but there's things, you know, going on around the world of great concern. You know, war in Ukraine. There's, you know, what's the Fed going to do in Washington on interest rates? People in Newton are very nationally and globally focused. But you know, I believe in the mantra of the environmental movement: think globally, act locally. And one responsibility we have as citizens in a democracy is to participate in elections. And I think that there's been fairly low early voting so far, but we have an election coming up on Tuesday, the 14th of March. So if you're watching this in reruns and it's past Tuesday the 14th, you missed your chance. There are going to be 3 questions on the ballot: 1 override of Proposition 2.5 and 2 debt exclusions to build high schools. People refer to them all as overrides.
Elementary school.
No, sorry, elementary schools. Sorry, to build schools. I said high schools. We've already gone through that, building high schools, to build new schools in the city. You know, it's really interesting to me in reading the views on why from the opponents of what they say we shouldn't, they think we shouldn't vote for these, which is they say inflation. Now it reminds me, I was 10 years old at the time in 1980 when Proposition 2.5 was enacted, but I remember the debate. And people said, why would you limit property tax increases to 2.5%? What if inflation's more than 2.5%? And Barbara Anderson, who was the head of Citizens for Limited Taxation, the organization advocating the statewide ballot question, said, that's simple. We built a mechanism into Prop 2.5 to deal with that scenario. It's called an override. And she said, people would be crazy if inflation was more than 2.5% not to vote for an override. Well, inflation in Newton is about 7% now in the metropolitan Boston area. Our energy costs are going up, our labor costs are going up, our construction and maintenance costs are going up. We would be crazy in Newton not to vote for this operating override. But whether you agree with me or not, I strongly believe that in a democracy, you get the government you deserve. So please, please, whether you're for or against these ballot questions, vote on Tuesday, the 14th, or earlier if there's still early voting going on, or by mail if you can't go in person. And please also join us again next time when we try to find just a little bit more common ground. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you.
It's great to have you.
And
on.
thank you.
Anticipate potential delays for the morning commute. In other news, a recent government report on prescription drug pricing points to corporate
Freedom of the press is about your right to know.
create offenses.
What are you talking about, man? Look at his stats.
Clark sheer athleticism.
It's about your right to be informed. Your right to access all types of information keeps us free as a nation.
No.
Today, there are real threats to press freedom
Reaching residential areas by...
and your right to know about the world around us.
Look,
Some threats are obvious, some are easy to miss, but they all put our way of life at risk. We must defend against all of these threats. no matter what kind of news is important to you.
Justified putting American troops in harm's way?
That's a great question.
We must protect our right to know before it's too late. Understand the threats. ProtectPressFreedom.org.